Fantastic. Thank you all for joining us. This is the second part of our technology forum. I'm Curtis Vanderwall. I'm Deputy Director with the California Transportation Commission. And for our next presentation, we have Dr. Susan Shaheen. Dr. Shaheen is an internationally recognized expert in mobility and the sharing economy. She's authored over 60 journal articles, over 100 reports and proceedings articles. She's got 7 book chapters, and she's co-edited 2 books. Her research projects on car sharing, smart parking, and older mobility have received national awards. And in May of last year, she was named one of the top 10 academic thought leaders in transportation. So I will turn you over to her for our next presentation on technology and community.
Thank you. All right. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. I hope everybody's doing well. I'm delighted to be here, and I thank the Commission for inviting me to give these remarks. So I am focused largely on the sharing economy, but in that context, I also look at other disruptive technologies, which include automation and connectivity, and electrification is also part of that. What I wanted to share with you today is sort of a discussion, quick whirlwind tour through about 2 decades of my research on shared mobility. So I'm going to tell you what we know, and unfortunately there's a lot that we don't know. But the good point is that we do know some things, and the research is getting more sophisticated, not surprisingly, over the last decade or so. I also want to take a moment to just talk about what's going on in public transit. About a week ago, I was in Chicago meeting with executives from the American Public Transit Association, and we were talking about a really similar topic here, and I thought it was really important to draw attention to the idea that we need to think about the impacts of the sharing economy, not just on individual users, but on the total ecosystem, and what impacts that could have on public transit itself. And I think it's really important to talk about research and data and the role those items play as we start to move into more sophisticated shared services. What are they doing to our transportation ecosystem, and how do we get at this in the absence of data? So we've talked quite a bit here about the private sector and that there are proprietary interests and considerations. How do we continue to learn and understand, I think, is a really important question. How do we get around the idea that the private sector does have proprietary interests, but there are also interests on the public's part that we need to understand what's happening on our roads and the impacts for society and the environment. I also wanted to share with you some shared automated vehicle updates. Prepared those for some comments that I made at the Automated Vehicle Symposium, and then just some final thoughts about, I think, the role of public policy, which I think is highly relevant here. So this is a shared mobility ecosystem diagram. I don't know if anybody has seen this. We prepared this for a document with the Federal Highway Administration. And what it illustrates is the whole ecosystem of shared services. So in our definition, we include these core and incumbent services that include public transit, traditional taxi services, car rental services that have been with us for a very long time, and those are highlighted in the right. And over to the left is the complete list, to my knowledge, of the ecosystem of shared mobility services that are infused with information technology. I think something that's important to note here is that they are starting to move into goods delivery. So we are monitoring now developments in the area of courier network services as well. And I think we're going to continue to see a crossover between both private delivery and goods delivery. And in the middle, you see some incumbent services like carpooling, vanpooling, casual carpooling that are sort of in the middle of that Venn, because many of those are starting to experience information technology changes. So they're evolving. So the first area I wanted to speak to is car sharing, and this is one of the mainstays of shared mobility. And it's been with us for quite a long time. My doctoral dissertation research a number of years ago indicated that it started in Switzerland back in 1947. So it's been with us, and it's a response to basically economic recession type activities and people wanting to have access to a car, but not necessarily being able to afford the cost of vehicle ownership. So it dates back that far. And we've been collecting North American census data for, a really long time, since I think I came to Berkeley around 2000, so it's been a long time. And I don't have, obviously, the full histogram here for you. But what this represents, actually, is the latest membership numbers from January 2007 in terms of the North American area. And the United States is at about 1.4 million. Now, I'm working on the peer-to-peer numbers. This includes one-way car sharing and round trip. So round trip is you go into and out of the same location, popularized by companies like Zipcar. One-way car sharing is you go from point to point, but you're typically in a geofenced area, popularized by companies like cont'd. And I'm going to actually share some cont'd data with you. So this is a study of one-way car sharing. We released this last summer. We spent a number of years on this particular study. It's a pretty big deep dive, and it features 5 North American cities. So it allows us to see differences by city. And I think one of the big takeaways here is that location matters. Time matters. Impacts are going to be different based on temporal and spatial scale. And this particular study, I think, illustrates that very well. It's methodologically driven by both online surveys with users, but also hard activity-based platform data that we received from the company. And so this is just an infographic that gives you a sense of across those 5 cities what the impacts were. And you can see that we see a reduction in vehicle holdings, so about 2 to 5% of the membership across that entire approximately 9,500 survey sample sold a vehicle. That translates to taking about 1 to 3 cars off the road as a result of a single car-to-go vehicle. And then what we do see is quite a bit larger number, 7 to 10%, are actually postponing or suspending a car purchase. And we're starting to see that data effect occurring over and over again in our studies, because I think people are starting to not own cars because they don't necessarily need to own a car. So in our earlier research on round-trip car sharing, we tended to see higher reductions in vehicle portfolios because people owned cars and then decided, wow, with car sharing, I don't need to own a car. Well, now we're seeing a lot of people going into these types of services without owning a car, but realizing I don't need to acquire a car. So they're not, truly shedding a car, but they're avoiding that car purchase. And you can see that the number of cars taken off the road as a result of those postponements is estimated at about 4 to 9. To the right, you can see here that one car-to-go vehicle, when you aggregate all of that together, is replacing about 7 to 11 cars. When we look at the implications of a vehicle sale, right, because a car is a fixed asset and now we're turning that fixed asset into variable costs, people start to do the math and they start to travel differently. Now they're not taking as many trips with the personal car, and their VMT, or vehicle miles traveled, is being reduced. And so what we see from the car-to-go analysis across the 5 cities is a reduction of about 6 to 16% in aggregate across that total sample of the VMT, and corresponding about a 4 to 18% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So this is what we're seeing from the one-way car sharing research. And this is a diagram, or a table actually, that shows the 5 cities, and you can see how they're different based on the cities when we contrast those same data in this format. You can see they're not the same. San Diego, it ranges from 1 to 7 vehicles being removed. Calgary is at 2 to 11. So you can see that each city in each environment, so we would argue the built environment, is really impacting the impacts. And we don't think it's just the built environment, we also think it's the spatial scale in which these trips are occurring that also needs to be examined. We also released in fall 2016 results of a study we did in conjunction with Zipcar. So this is the round trip model. And we were able to do the first study of the college-university market segment to see how youth were responding to this and how it was affecting their lives. And we were also able to do a deep dive with this substantial population. You can see about 27,000 people responded to it. That we were able to learn a lot across North America. And I will get into these results a little bit more deeply. So about 80% of the university's Zipcar members don't own a car. About 43% of them sold or put off or postponed that car purchase. And about 40% are less likely to buy a car as a result of being inside of a shared car service. And we also mapped these effects across Canada and the United States and showed how the vehicle miles traveled and the GHG differences occurred based on what region of the United States you were in, and also if you were potentially in an urban or rural type setting, or an urban and rural setting, I believe is exactly how we did it. And what you can see across the board here is that the differences do matter on where you are located, the built environment is playing out, and there may be some cultural level issues that are also playing out based on what region of North America you're in. But you can see that across the college-university market, we're seeing GHG reductions as high as about 2.6%, and vehicle miles traveled reductions as a result of college-university car sharing at about 5%. Next, I want to move us over to another form of shared mobility, and this is a form a lot of you know as a transportation network company. We coined the term Ridesourcing back in 2014. We really liked that term because we felt like it was very instructive of what the apps were doing. We feel they're a platform that's used to source rides, and they're often called a ride hail. That's, I think, somewhat confusing because legally they're not allowed to hail. And they certainly aren't ride sharing, because those of you that know the definition of ride sharing legally know that that's an incidental trip. It's not a commercial based trip. And so your insurance is different, taxation is different, the whole transaction itself is different when it's a commercial transaction. And these are some data that we were able to collect back in January of 2016, just to give you a size of the scales of these markets. And we looked also at eHail, which is essentially a platform that's used to source rides, but used in the taxi industry itself. You can see that there's a lot of activity in this particular space, and those numbers are certainly growing in terms of the footprint of all of this technology for on-demand mobility. So we are currently conducting a study with the Natural Resources Defense Council that was generously funded by ULIT. And our study is in collaboration with both Lyft and Uber, and it has 6 unique data sets being streamed into it, and we are waiting for the very last data set. So I hope to be able to share those results with you very soon. We looked at 3 specific markets for this particular study that had robust enough markets that we could see what the pooled activity was like in contrast to the unpooled activity. So there's Uber Pool, and there's Uber. There's Lyft Line, and there's Lyft. And so the study team agreed that we would go into San Francisco, LA, and Washington, D.C., because those were 3 cities that were at a more robust level in order to take the pooled activity and get a match. We don't necessarily want to study a city where people are selecting a pooled ride but not getting matched. We want to see a much more resilient dynamic to see how that's affecting, particularly auto ownership, VMT, and greenhouse gas emissions. Now, this is a study that I was part of with my colleagues at UC Berkeley. We conducted this in 2014, so this was before Uber Pool and Lyft Line existed. And Sidecar was also on board. We did this in the San Francisco area. And what we showed in this clipboard study back in summer of 2014 was that about 92% of the people would have made this trip, but about 8% were induced trips. So these are trips that would not have happened otherwise that are resulting as course of having availability of an on-demand ride service. Right? And about 33% of those trips would have been taken by public transit. The vast majority would have been taken by bus. About 9% of them would have been taken by rail. We did also find that about 4% of those trips were first mile, last mile trips. So we did see the potential for that first mile, last mile connectivity. And we also found that about 20% of the trips avoided drinking and driving. And so we're really excited to someday, very soon, unveil the results of those three-city study, and to see how they compare to the 2014 results. Now, quickly moving on to bike sharing. This is a mode that I think many of us are familiar with. We've seen an explosion of the bike sharing model, and in fact, what we're starting to see is an explosion of a new model that will move us into free floating, away from a station-based approach. And these are data from April of 2016 from Russell Medin that show you essentially the key takeaway from this slide, right, is that the vast majority of these bikes are in China. And I would say that that is not letting up at all, because the free floating bike share model is really taking off. Some of the more recent data I've seen suggest that it's on par with the station-based model at present. And those systems that were just coming online just about a year ago. So they are heavy duty moving forward, and they're starting to be deployed in the United States. The free floating model, which means they do not require the street furniture. So you can see that in the US, about 100 cities back in April had these systems. We continue to see a really massive appetite for active transportation in the area of shared mobility. This is a 5-city study that we conducted that included Mexico City and also Montreal and Toronto. I'm going to show you some results from that. And this is another infographic. So we found that across these cities, about 5.5% of the people that used bike sharing said they sold or postponed a vehicle purchase because they now had access to this mode. About 58% increased their cycling. And about 50% said they relied much less heavily on private vehicles as a result. So bike sharing, in terms of public transit use, this was one of the first studies where we did GIS mapping. And what we did is we learned that when we looked at different cities, we saw different implications of the built environment. So in the Twin Cities, we saw that bike sharing was very much a first mile, last mile connector. It allowed the transit system to sort of expand and connect. And in more dense urban areas like Washington, D.C., we saw more complementarity, but also competition. Now, some might say that's a bad thing, but in the city of D.C., we interviewed them, and they said, well, this is exactly what we wanted. We wanted to peak shave, and we wanted to extend the reach of public transit through active transportation. So they did not view that as competition. They viewed it as complementarity and the extension of their services. But the point I think that I want to keep coming back to is that the built environment, the size of the population, do matter in terms of its impacts. There's also microtransit, and this is the idea of a shuttle service. Yep. And that shuttle service is a great opportunity for people to get in right-sized vehicles when perhaps there's more congestion. And so oftentimes you see these running during weekday hours and at peak. And two of the services that are active are Chariot and also Via, and each is expanding their footprints and their partnerships. And this is the idea that you could have a flexible shuttle moving along, or you could have a fixed route shuttle. And so we see applications of both of them. We did do a study with Bridge, Kansas City Bridge. Bridge is no longer part of the ecosystem of shared mobility at this time, but they did a partnership with Kansas City. And what we saw there in that study was that we probably need to really think much more carefully about where to place these systems. So they weren't quite getting the ridership that they wanted. And we also found out that a lot of people just didn't understand what the service was. They had downloaded the app but never used it. We had free rides and they weren't using the free rides. So I think that's a cautionary note, right, for all of us that think about these types of things every day, that we have to educate people on what these things are. Now, we all may know what these things are, but when we go to provide these types of services to the traveling public, we have to really work hard on that education and outreach and marketing. So now this part of the presentation brings me to this discussion of what's happening in public transit. I don't know how closely you're watching these numbers. I work in public transit quite a bit, and so I've been looking at these numbers, and I downloaded this data in preparation for a talk I was giving last week in Chicago with APTA. And what it shows is that there has been a decline between 2015 and 2016 in many of the transit markets. And there's a whole lot of reasons for that, right? I'm not suggesting this is all due to shared mobility at all, but I think what it is an important thing for us to think about is if we're moving into on-demand mobility and people like the idea of this and we feel we can provide more accessibility and access and societal benefits associated with it, what does this mean for public transit? Are we inducing more trips? Are we going to be able to connect to transit and provide a more holistic system? Or are these types of service going to compete with transit altogether? What happens if the cost of those services start to rise and some people can no longer afford to take those services? And we have gotten rid of certain bus lines or maybe even rail lines. So I think what's really important for us to think about is the dynamics and the evolution and the disruption that we're currently seeing in our system, and think holistically about what kind of world do we want to live in and what type of system do we want to provide that includes both accessibility and social equity in the mix. So again, I think this is fairly instructive that we need to be cautious in our decision making and in our planning in the short, medium, and long term about the systems that we're creating, particularly as we go to shared automated vehicle systems. So this shows the line in which there was no change, and above were slight increases in public transit, and everything below that red line indicates declines in public transit. So, and again, not implying at all that that's all due to shared mobility services. There's a number of things going on in the economy, and I'd be happy to treat those in a question if you like. The decrease, I'd have to look more closely into that data for you. I'm not sure that that's factored in there. It does, Marco? The bus is down. Rail is up, bus is down. Okay. Okay. Same trend in New York. Yep. Across. Yeah.
Susan, can you repeat
you were saying that across UCLA, a UCLA study?
Yeah, the UCLA did a study.
It'd be easier for you to say that.
Some of the UCLA researchers have been looking at the decline in LA, and they presented recently and talked about the fact that the decline is being driven by change in 12 bus lines, and they've been digging into the demographic data and the immigration status and the fact that households that have been in the country longer change their travel habits, and so it's kind of a complicated mix of factors having not to do, in fact, with these other options as much as changing household status in that case.
Right. But I think overall, right, there's a lot going on, right? Some of our transit systems are in a state of disrepair. They're woefully underfunded for those repairs. Look at the cost of gasoline. How can that not be playing out a factor? How can the turnaround in the economy following the Great Recession not be playing a factor, right? So there's a lot going on. But I think the point of this slide is, right, is that I think we should be vigilant when we're thinking about public policy and we're thinking about holistically where we want to go. You know, what would happen if we do lose some of our public transit services and we aren't able to move people around? Like, what are we going to do about that? And some locations, maybe the empty buses should be replaced by microtransit or Uber Lyft type service, but in other locations maybe we should shore up those resources and get those trains fixed and running on schedule again. because they're long-haul distance trains. So I think it's just meant to sort of be a little bit provocative with respect to our thinking about the impacts of shared mobility on our overall system. And again, I wanted to emphasize some research that's been done here in terms of the Ridesourcing and TNC space. I've already featured the study that we did in 2014 in San Francisco, but you can see this spring Reuters did a survey. It indicated as high as 38% decline in public transit use as a result of these services, so even higher than our 33%. A recent doctoral dissertation came out of Denver that suggested a 22% decline in public transit. So again, what I want us to think about is what are the overall impacts and where are we going and what are we trying to achieve as we think about public policy. And you know, I'm a researcher, so it's probably not surprising to hear me say that I think we really need to think about doing more research and really understanding the relationship between a lot of these variables. And I think we don't have enough deep, rich understanding of behavioral economics and travel behavior and how trip time and trip cost, time of day, all of these things come into play and how that affects people's demand and also the implications for the overall transportation system and where we want to put our dollars. So some questions I've laid out for the public transit industry is to figure out, you know, when is shared mobility actually complementing the public transit system and when is it competing? And if it is competing, is that with an intention designed to do so? Like in the case of Capital Bikeshare, where they liked the idea that they were peak shaving and they were spreading people out onto an active form of public transport. And how does that vary based on the shared mode? Does it differ by bike sharing and car sharing and ride sourcing or microtransit? And overall, you know, how can we enhance public transit? Now, Randy Iwasaki was here earlier and he talked about Easy Mile and the ability to do first mile connectivity, and that's something people in Contra Costa County really would like to have more access to because they don't have enough parking at the BART stations, and parking is very expensive to build. And overall, you know, in terms of our efficiency, how can we be more efficient with the public transit system? So can we spend our dollars more efficiently and not have a lot of empty buses that are inflexible in terms of their routing, you know, roaming around? And then ultimately, what's the role of public transit if we evolve into a more shared automated vehicle future? So we can't do research and answer all these questions in the absence of data and in the absence of good methodological approaches and models and tools. And so in this slide, I just talk about the need for more consistent data metrics, more availability of data. How are we going to get that data? Do we have the tools? Are we developing the models for projecting out to 2050 what the impacts are? Do the models factor in shared automated vehicles? Do they factor in drones and unmanned aerial vehicle travel and all of these things? Like, how do we need to be preparing for the future? Not just in light of public policy, but so that we can optimize and maximize the transportation system for all travelers and all users of the network. I definitely argue that I think we need more longitudinal tracking. So you might say, wow, Susan, you've got the answers to a lot of this. But the thing is that the systems are evolving and changing every day. There's new users coming online. The diffusion curve is changing in terms of who's using these services. So I would argue that we need longitudinal historical tracking as well as forecasting that helps us to understand those temporal and spatial differences as well. At 7 p.m. in the evening, we might not be as worried about traffic on the road, and we might think that's good for the economy because we're getting people to the restaurants. But at 8 a.m., we may not want all that activity on the roadway. So the time of day really does matter, as well as that built environment. So overall, we think that research could help inform public policy and decision making, so that we're not guessing, but that we are really much more precise in terms of our public policy tools. And the policies really need to also get at data sharing. So how do we get at getting to a point where we're not at an impasse for data? And I think that's something we really have to work on and think hard about. You know, how can we use more geofencing? How can we use more cloud-based computing and protection of data, but getting access to the right people inside the cloud who can use the data to help inform policymaking and to optimize that system? And we would argue that it's absolutely essential to have data to ultimately get to this endpoint of a seamless multimodal system. So this is a quote that I love to share, and it's that this comes from a chief data scientist, that without data, you're just another person with an opinion. And so I'm sure you've had a lot of conversations with people about services like Uber and Lyft and what's happening. But is that anecdotal or is it data-driven? Do we really know if drivers are happy or unhappy, or where they drive in from, or how much they circle around to get access to a trip, to a fare? So without data, we really don't know, and we're going to be guessing and fumbling around a bit in the dark with our policies. This is the idea of just a framework for how to go about this. So we are working really closely with the Federal Highway Administration and the Federal Transit Administration right now. They have a program called the Mobility on Demand Sandbox, and we're part of the independent evaluation team. So we've developed this framework to help them abstract and construct the right questions and get the right data to study these 11 pilot projects that were funded back in 2016. So developing evaluation hypotheses, consistent performance metrics, mechanisms to inform those metrics, so where are we getting the data, and then ultimately the right analysis and evaluation tools that hopefully get us to state of the art. And then finally, what I wanted to get to is this idea of this convergence, and a lot of people have been talking about it. It has lots of different names. Some people refer to it as heaven and hell, some people the three revolutions. It's got many, many names, faves, aces, all that. So a close colleague of mine called it Sika many years ago, and that's Tim Papandreou. He now works for a company called Waymo, and Waymo is Google X's program that looks at automation, and he used that terminology because he felt it was a more engineering term. Sharing, electrification, connected and automated. And he felt it was really important to acknowledge that these vehicles do need to be connected, particularly if they're going to be electric, because we do need to know where to charge them and where to park them and that kind of thing, because they are going to have to be stationed somewhere. And this is the idea that in our view, so this is our view of the world, that it's not just the three components of a revolution, but there's actually a really important enabling technology, which is the mobile IT component. So where are we in SAV land? So there has been a lot of activity in the United States in just 2016 into 2017. And what I call out here are conventional SAV pilots. So you see Waymo, Uber's piloting, and there's also an interesting one in Singapore. And I'm going to go through these really quickly. So Waymo started their program with hybrid minivans in Phoenix, and their goal is to go from 100 of these vehicles in testing situations out to 600 in different applications. Phoenix is really focused on looking at those hot weather desert types of conditions for operations. Uber started in September of 2016 with their program in Pittsburgh area, and they are testing away. I think they stopped for a moment when there was an accident in Arizona, and they're back online again. And then I think a really interesting deployment is with Nutonomy in Singapore, and they started in August of 2016. So you see this theme of a lot of activity really getting rolling in summer, fall of 2016, and now moving into 2017. Interestingly, Nutonomy has partnered with Grab, which is essentially a taxi to move us into the idea of robo-taxis. And I do think these Asian markets are where we're going to see a lot of action in this particular space, because the scale is really high in terms of the number of trips and the number of taxis that are on the road. And then these are some planned SAV pilots. There's Easy Mile that's being planned in Treasure Island. You heard from Randy about his efforts in Contra Costa County. Also, Ollie is another shuttle type service, and they're deploying in Miami and Las Vegas. And we also see the SAV pilots in the conventional applications planned, and Nutonomy again showing up in partnership with Lyft. Lyft's been partnering quite a bit with the AV companies, and my latest count was I think we're at about 31 companies total, and Lyft's philosophy is more of an open platform approach. So I think we're going to see Lyft partnering with quite a few of these companies. And then, what I wanted to note was that partnership was just announced in June, and they said in the press release that they could be testing on the ground as soon as a couple months from now. So that's already now, today. I haven't heard anything yet. And then Delphi and Transdev have also discussed their partnership in this context, and that's in Normandy and in Paris, and we're likely to see something as soon as 2019. So, overall, I think we have to think really carefully about where we're going. So I've given you sort of a baseline of shared mobility and its impacts without that automation and electrification in most cases. And here I just think it's important that we think about a lot of implications for these types of services. Will Sika types of services be able to help bridge the gap in the first mile, last mile? Serve people who have previously been unserved, or serve areas that lack public transit altogether? What efficiency gains might we be able to achieve in those locations? I really do think that these pilot programs are essential, getting data from these pilots and trying to systematically examine them across the pilots so that we can aggregate that knowledge and experience as quickly as possible and share that. I do think there is a role for public policy in all of this, and I hope you agree. And I think partnerships can really facilitate that. I do think we've got to get to a place where we're more openly sharing understanding and information from both the public side and the private side, but in this case, even just public sharing of information, more repositories so people can get access to this information. We definitely think that governmental agencies could attract private sector support by thinking about what they would like access to and where they can meet in a win-win type of situation. I think more of those dialogues need to occur. I also think that we may be in a place where we need to start examining finance quite a bit more in a pricing type environment. How should we think about possible subsidies for people who are taking pooled rides, coming from those people who are taking the non-pooled rides? Can we subsidize and encourage the behaviors that we want if we agree that it's better to have more people in a vehicle than less in terms of pooling? I've already, I think, made the case about pilots and evaluation. I think that's absolutely critical, and we really need to start getting this into our modeling efforts. I mentioned a couple policies here at the California state level. And let's face it, things are moving super fast. So we need to focus on this now and stay on top of it. And I don't think we have the answer to all of these questions today. I think we've got to keep evolving our thinking and moving forward. I do think the public sector really needs to get to be more and more proactive in this and less reactionary. And so I think particularly in the case of Sika, we've got some room to do that, but we have to advance those conversations now. And I'd love to be part of the discussion about data sharing and how we're going to get to a point where we have better access to data and rules about ensuring that all the shared mobility operators are having to share data, not just certain ones that have contracts and others that don't associated with that. We're going to be doing a lot of research. We're going to keep up our efforts. I've already mentioned the NRDC study, if you were curious about that. We will be releasing our latest numbers on international growth of car sharing and US growth. So stay tuned for those. We are wrapping up a peer-to-peer car sharing, so that's when you put your own private vehicle into car sharing study, and a GHG and bike sharing study. We're also working, as I mentioned, on the mobility on demand FTA sandbox. I think there's going to be a lot of really great understanding coming out of that particular program. So this is just some concluding thoughts that I came together in my mind when I was trying to wrap this up, is that I've already stated change is coming really fast now, and I think there's a chance that we may be starting to get numb to it, that there's been some serious disruption, and the disruption just keeps coming. So you almost have this sense of safety or incrementalism. But I don't really actually think that's the case. I think what we're experiencing practically every day is pretty disruptive. And so I think we need to be more on guard and less feeling like, oh, okay, this is just the way it is, right? Because I think if we're vigilant and we understand what's coming, we can be much more proactive. You know, one big question that I have is ultimately, are people really going to not care about driving at all because they really want to be connecting to their devices and the media in their vehicles, if they're owned vehicles or shared vehicles? And I do truly believe that the future is something we are all collectively creating now, and we should work on that together. And that I think we can be part of creating those preferred outcomes versus reacting to those, particularly if we have these types of policy discussions. I think we absolutely need more discussion on social engineering. I think artificial intelligence and machine learning can be an amazing thing, but it can also be a very scary thing. And so we should talk about what that means for our society. And clearly, without data and research, you're just another person with an opinion. And so I think we need to work a lot harder on that. We have a weekly curated newsletter, pretty simple to read, 5 stories a week. If you guys are open, want to read it, it's for free. You just subscribe at the bottom of this particular website. These are a number of reports that have come out, one on smartphone apps, 2 on shared mobility, 1 from a planning perspective, and 1 from more of a perimeter-based perspective. And if your appetite for all of this is just voracious, we have released a new book I just edited. It's already been downloaded 30,000 times from Springer, so I think a lot of people are very interested in this, and this is 20 chapters of, I think, state-of-the-art thinking on disruption in this space. So with that, I'd like to conclude my remarks, and I'd love to hear more from you.
Thank you, Susan. Go ahead and hold on to that. So I've been told that we have a little bit of extra time in the panel, and I'm sure there are lots of questions out there about the ride sharing, about the public transit. One issue that I know that we've really been running into already a lot is how to balance access to data, particularly for researchers, versus privacy. If you can quickly answer that, and then we'll open it up to the rest.
So I think that the data question is not answered at all. And the question of level of aggregation is very important in that particular context. And one of the hard parts with some of these types of services is, for example, in the case of Uber and Lyft, in our study, we have 2 competitors. And so even if we aggregate those numbers and just give you the aggregated level numbers, they can subtract from the aggregate numbers to see what their competitor is doing. So it's not the easiest situation to work through when you have a competitor or 2 competitors in that marketplace. When you can aggregate up to 15, 16 different providers, it becomes an easier question to solve. So I do think we need to refine our data agreements. We've come a long way in 2 years in terms of working on data agreements. We feel like we understand quite a bit about how the private sector would like to proceed, what they would like to protect. But we also have to think about data storage. We have to think about data privacy. We have to think about cybersecurity. And we also have to think about FOIA requests. That's actually another really big deal. So if we get the data, can somebody FOIA the data, and then the data gets released? So I think that's why I'm starting to favor this idea of some kind of a cloud-based solution that has tiers of access in it, involved in it.
Fantastic. Questions from the audience?
Hey, Susan. So I wanted to ask you about duopolies versus oligopolies versus monopolies in this market. So it seems that here in the US, a duopoly has emerged between Uber and Lyft. Over in China, we had a duopoly until Uber pulled out and Didi secured its monopoly. In India, there seems to be Ola and Uber. Southeast Asia, Grab and Uber. And then in Europe, we have an oligopoly with Uber and MyTaxi and a variety of others. And maybe because there's a little bit more socialism and protectionism over there in Europe. I'd like to hear your opinion on here in the U.S., how do you see the number of players evolving? Do you think that we continue with this duopoly, or one of Uber and Lyft and eventually conquers the other, or do you think actually new smaller players that they'd already been kind of killed off, do you think some will start eventually coming back and nipping at their heels?
Right. Well, thanks for the question. I think that we could go in a number of different directions. Right? I think there are a lot of companies that want to play in this space. And when we saw the regulations change in Austin, Texas, a number of ride-sourcing companies emerged. And now that the state regulation has changed, Uber and Lyft are back in the market, and they're losing market share. So I lead you to that example because I think it's rather illustrative, right? Is public policy matters. And it can affect whether or not those new entrants can actually get in, or whether or not they can survive if something has changed in that ecosystem. But what we saw was, well over a handful of operators assuming that space with very different ranging business models. So I think a lot of it has to do with the kind of outcomes we want to see and achieve. But it's risky, because the thing that I think we have to be really concerned about as a society is, well, on-demand mobility is wonderful. I've been studying it for over 2 decades. I've known how wonderful it is to get away from fixed ownership costs to variable costs. But what kind of society are we going to create if not everybody can afford those services? And what happens when the true costs of those services are charged? And do we have a public transit infrastructure to support trips? So to me, that's one of the things that really keeps me up at night when we think about all of this innovation and disruption. And I think the role of public policy and all of us in this room spending time out of our busy days to talk about this is really critical. Because I think we have control over those outcomes on some level. And the best tool that I can think of is public policy.
All right, we have one more question over here. 2 more then.
Oh, okay, thanks. I have a question about Ridesourcing and public transit. We're working on something called the Innovative Clean Transit Rule that the Air Resources Board is basically looking to update its bus fleet regulation for transit buses. They've changed the name now to the Innovative Clean Transit Rule because they want to figure out how they could allow for the Uber and Lyft type services to come into play. So I'm just curious your take, or sort of first set of initial comments on sort of how to shape that incorporation into a regulation here in California, what we should be cautious of or mindful of, and I know that that's probably a longer conversation. I'm also curious what you brought up about bike sharing, and perhaps bike sharing should be added to what defines innovative in this transit regulation. And lastly, just a couple of thoughts on sort of social impacts of how this could affect transit. You mentioned already sort of the cost. We're not, I've heard that we pay less than half of what it truly costs for an Uber or Lyft ride is what people are paying. And then I've also read a little bit about how public transit employees who are often in a union, protected, those workers tend to be people of color, high rates of women in the workforce in public transit. And so, how do we really factor in those dynamics that, don't easily come down to, like a particular number, but how do we tell that story effectively? Are people actually considering those social impacts from this kind of transformation in our transportation and transit systems?
Yeah. Well, I appreciate everything you're mentioning, and each one of those is probably a fairly lengthy discussion. I think the idea of diversity in the transportation ecosystem is good. I'm trained as an ecologist, and when you have a monoculture, that's typically not a good thing. And so I think the idea of being open to innovation, if it's active transportation, Uber, Lyft, ride sourcing, in the context of providing accessibility and mobility is really important. But what I would caution you on is make sure you have a darn good evaluation plan that helps you calibrate that approach to that the innovative program that you mentioned, because I think oftentimes we do these pilots and the evaluation comes as an afterthought, or the evaluation is just simply underfunded. And doing evaluation at sort of the state-of-the-art level right now is very expensive and really time-consuming. I'm finding sometimes I'm spending 75% of that grant money chasing the data, not doing the analysis, right? And then once you have the data, you've got the gold mine, and we should be doing multiple studies off of that, and then you're on to the next study. So, you know, one of the things I've been really talking about a lot more publicly lately is I think we do really need to put more time and money into the evaluation process. And once we get that data, let's mine it. Let's not move to the next data acquisition effort and jam through that evaluation as quickly as we can. But that's the nature of evaluation. And I think this whole idea of implications of this transition that we're making in transportation, if you all agree that this is happening, you know, its impacts on labor and people of color and people that have been in protected classes like unions, all of this has to be rethought. And I haven't heard a lot of rich and robust discussion about implications about labor and what we're going to try to do about that, retraining. You know, I haven't even seen analysis that would suggest to me what the net effects are going to be when we convert from, say, a more incumbent or core type of public transit service to something that looks more like a Zipcar fleet or an SAV. I haven't seen numbers that suggest to me that there is a job loss, but we certainly are going to need job training. So those types of discussions we really need to start to elevate. And what I'd love to do is see us get beyond sort of these basic primer types of discussions into a much more deep, robust conversation about the economy, about labor, jobs, equity, the whole shooting match. And probably how do we really need to be talking about how do we reshape public transit and even what the definition of public transit is.
And the last question from Commissioner Edmond.
Yeah, I think my question kind of falls right in the middle of that. So you mentioned that you made a presentation at their association. So what was the response, or what did our transit partners,
Yeah.
they didn't like your slide, or they loved your slide, or they're going to peel the onion back, and maybe that's a data mining that you were speaking of? So
I think
what was the tone?
they want to dig in. So they asked me questions until it was time to wrap up, and they had even more questions. A lot of questions about SAV and Zipcar, big time, and how they need to prepare for something that becomes more automated. And do they replace bus lines? Do they need to rethink the paradigm of public transit? So I felt like it wasn't defensive at all. I think it was an open mind. And I think a realization that we have to start talking about the fact that public transit numbers aren't just on the up. They were increasing. And so maybe that gave us a false sense of security. But those numbers appear to be declining now.
did they come up with like a work plan of their next step then?
What I heard was they would be back in touch and hoped to have more robust discussions. So it was intended somewhat like this type of talk, to be ground setting, and then maybe we advance to multiple different forums and discussions.
Hopefully.
Thank you. And thank you very much, Dr. Shaheen. That was
Yes.
really informative. I think everybody
Thank you.
took a lot away. I'll turn this over to our Deputy Director, Garth Hopkins. And he'll lead the panel on transitioning to our existing transportation system.
Hi, everyone. As Curtis said, my name is Garth Hopkins with the California Transportation Commission. And while we have our last two panelists coming on up here, I just wanted to make sure everyone knew that on the California Transportation Commission website, we do have the agenda as well as the presentations if you wanted to view them, and also the bios as well. And so that's why we weren't doing extensive bios today. But oh, you know, I hadn't even asked. How about if we have Jennifer go first, or either way? Okay. a lot of planning goes into this, as you can tell. Jennifer Cohen is a Director of Government Affairs at the City of Los Angeles Department of Transportation. And as Director of Government Affairs, Jennifer is part of the executive team and acts as a primary liaison to the City Council and other government agencies. And our second speaker today is Catherine Mullins from RSM Technologies, and she's Director of Strategic Partnerships. And just real quick about, at RSM, Catherine is dedicated to facilitating the development of smarter, safer cities and providing innovative mobility solutions through emerging technology. And really, kind of this last panel was, we've had a lot of discussion today about all this new technology, and wow, there's a lot going to happen, but it's not going to happen overnight. And there's going to be this huge transition period, or I don't know, huge, some transition period that's going to occur. We're not all going to be driving in automated vehicles or whatever. And so that's what kind of we wanted to talk about a little bit more is what's going to happen during this transition period, or maybe give some food for thought during that time. So at any rate, with that, I'll turn it over to Jennifer.
Hello. Thanks for having me, and I'm glad everyone's still here after lunch. That means a lot to me. So I'm going to talk about the old and the new transportation systems. As we've talked about, the future is very bright. There are a lot of opportunities, be it from an environmental perspective or from a safety perspective. 50 years from now, things are going to be great, but we're heading into sort of an awkward, clunky period, or we already are in an awkward and clunky period in terms of partial automation, partial sharing. The models are changing, and it can go very well or it can go very poorly. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how Los Angeles is handling this. For those of you that are unfamiliar with the Los Angeles Department of Transportation, we handle a variety of modes, from taxis to transit to parking meters. And so the issues that we've talked about today, I'm not going to be able to cover all of them. I don't handle freight. So I'm not going to try and delve too far into that, but it's obviously a very important issue with great potential to go a variety of different ways. As the Department of Transportation, we have a number of charges. One of them is about safety. We also have adopted plans for sustainability and for mobility. And then similarly in the state legislature, you guys give direction in terms of laws that are adopted and policies. And so I think one of the most important things for us all to keep in mind is that while we do have new things coming online, like these, we still have the same charges, that we still have to move people and goods to school, to work. We have to do it safely, we have to do it environmentally friendly, and we have to have an eye towards economics. And so we don't want to ignore the old while we embrace the new. So for example, in Los Angeles County, we passed a significant sales tax this past November. We don't want to supplant these investments with new technology. We see technology as an opportunity to enhance it, but it's not meant to supplant it. So how do we handle this? Great news. We have a plan. Don't worry, everything's taken care of. Last year, the Los Angeles Department of Transportation adopted a technology strategy. And that is the website for it. And in this, it helps us to kind of have a North Star and to keep our eyes on the priorities of the city while creating a platform to embrace technology. We want to be hospitable, but we don't want technology to shape policy. We want policy to shape technology. It's a very important thing that I want everyone to understand, that it's very sexy to adopt the newest and greatest technology, but that may not necessarily deliver the goals that we are charged with. So as we look into our urban mobility in a digital age, there are a couple of foundational points, which really echo Dr. Shaheen's points in terms of we need to build a solid data foundation. If we don't know what our city looks like, we can't build infrastructure to support new technology or the needs of our citizens. We have had a lot of trouble with private sector giving us our data. In terms of what Dr. Shaheen explained, there is a lot of concern about access to that data, FOIAing the data, giving away personal information. But as cities, if we don't know why cars or automated vehicles are disengaging, we can't help that. I need to know, is it the paint condition? Is it the road condition? Is it lighting? What do our signals need to look like? How do those communicate with automated and connected vehicles? And this creates sort of a platform so that we are able to pivot and embrace. As we saw with TNCs coming online, everyone was caught flat-footed. People did not anticipate how this would revolutionize mobility in cities. We don't want to be caught off guard in the same way as new and innovative technologies come online, but we also need to be prepared to address when there are data needs, when there are problems, what have you, and we need to be able to evaluate and just not go down a road. 3 of the main components of our transportation plan are to look at mobility, data, and infrastructure as a service, which I think were somewhat explained earlier today, but just briefly, this kind of changes the role of cities in terms of just being a static existence in our infrastructure, that we are providing these things as services. Data is, again, so critical and so important for our decision making. And it also allows the systems to be dynamic so that we are not wedded to one thing. We can adjust as trends take place, as one-time events occur. So let's say that we have the Olympics in Los Angeles. We can adjust and pivot, but we don't have to. It's happening. We don't need to build entirely new infrastructure, but how we manage the infrastructure and how we adapt to it can be managed with data. And similarly, mobility as a service, really focusing on the customer. I've had a couple of conversations today with people in terms of the fare medium that we use, and that as passengers, we don't really care where our money's going. We just want it to be seamless. And so seeing mobility as a service that you can pay with one platform, and that you can go from bike to rail to a TNC seamlessly. And similarly, the infrastructure as a service, how we price that, and recognizing the true cost of using that, be it a parking space or a seat on a train. So we've covered a lot today. I think that there are a number of considerations for cities. We are the boots on the ground. We are the ones that are going to have to respond when there is a crash, when the system breaks down. We are the ones that are going to be footing a lot of the bill. So in terms of the parking discussion earlier, citation revenue and parking revenue will decline. So will the gas tax revenue. And this, while it affects the city, don't forget at the state level, you do take about $12 to $17 of every parking citation. So if parking citations are eliminated, that also hits the state. We're also going to be looking to the state to help build new signals. As Catherine will talk about, there is a whole new universe of signals that are coming, and I don't think that the cities are budgeting for them, and I definitely don't think the state is either. Correct me if I'm wrong. So some of the other decision-making points that we have coming are about, there are some local control issues, which is a much bigger federal discussion right now. I'm not sure if anyone was following last week's excitement in the House E&C committee, where there's a huge debate about preemption and the federal government preempting state laws. I personally don't feel that we want to upend a system that is working fairly well for a single technology, and so I'm reluctant to promote the state losing control of aspects that they currently oversee. But we also need to look at, when we lose that control, are we losing control over congestion? And how are we looking at our congestion management in a new framework? If we just replace each of our current passenger cars with an automated vehicle, we won't be achieving the environmental or the congestion or even the equity goals that we have as a state. I think that equity is a really important piece that is not often mentioned. Traditionally, people of means have the most access to new technology. So think about your Apple Watch or your Tesla. We need to make sure that the advantages and opportunities that come with new technologies are shared amongst everyone, and that this has tremendous opportunity for the disabled community, for the low income, for the elderly, for mobility impaired. There are such great opportunities that we don't want to miss. Another thought to think about, especially in the public sector, is about the role of law enforcement. I don't know how you pull over an automated vehicle. So in terms of how do you, if someone, it's not necessarily that the vehicle itself has committed a crime, but what if the person inside has? And how do we make sure that you pull over AVs the same way regardless of the brand? Because it's wholly inefficient for our law enforcement to have a book to look up, oh, this kind of car, I pull over it this way or what have you. And finally, I just want to reiterate the importance of data. I know that that has been repeated time and time again, but we need data so desperately to be able to make efficient and educated decisions across the board. And with that, I will pass the mic.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having us today. As Garth mentioned, my name is Catherine Mullins, and I'm the head of strategic partnerships at RSM Technologies. We're a small startup based out of Sausalito here in the Bay Area, and we're focused on intelligent infrastructure. So a couple of different things I'd like to cover today. One, just give a brief background of our technology and what we're up to, talk a little bit about the importance of intelligent infrastructure, and then dive into the role of cities and other public sector partners, and some thoughts on policy. We're probably one of the few companies that have chosen to engage with cities in pilot projects as we launch our products to market, and so I think we've got some unique insights from the last year or so. So quick background on RSM. We're originally a European company. We've been in the US for about 3 years. We have a computational intelligence platform called Simon that was designed to manage urban traffic intersections in real time. So we install hardware to collect information on cars, buses, and bikes, most often radar sensors, or we can grab information from existing sensors, and then our algorithms were designed to manage those intersections in real time, as opposed to the signals basically cycling through set signal phase and timing programs. We're a hardware and data agnostic system, so we can pull information from a broad suite of sensors, which also allows us to incorporate data on multiple modes into a single simulated model. And what we end up with is a live simulation of the intersection environment or the transportation zone that can then be used to provide analytics to cities, or in a management capacity, which we're still piloting, actually control the intersection in real time. Right now, in terms of where we're at as a company in our development, we're currently doing a number of demonstration projects with public sector partners, and we provide access to all of our data analytics and analytics for free, basically, via RSM's dashboard. So just to go through some key uses quickly, intersection efficiency is one of the big things we talk about with cities, so understanding wasted green signals. Obviously, if the system were under control of our algorithms, we'd be able to manage that in real time. For now, we're providing this information to cities so that it can help inform their existing signal phase and timing plans, broader transportation planning efforts, Vision Zero, so in some instances we're collecting information on pedestrians as well with sensors, helping cities understand the movements of pedestrians and where they're at the intersection, providing data and analytics for connected autonomous vehicles. At this point, this data is not safety critical, but designed to help autonomous vehicles navigate through pilot zones more efficiently, looking at things like route planning and wayfinding, also providing travel times through a given zone, and potentially even using these vehicles as speed harmonization agents to help control traffic flows. Smart logistics and public transit prioritization, so working with signal prioritization to speed the movement of some vehicles, whether that's a commercial vehicle that's trying to move freight or a public transit vehicle that's trying to make its way along its route quickly. And then, as mentioned, determining overall performance of the signal system as a whole. So one of the unique aspects of our system is our software is cloud-based, so we can gather information on multiple intersections and start to do comparative analytics really across a system. Our CEO really likes to emphasize that Simon is a platform for intelligent cities, and so we see a lot of these different uses including providing data for autonomous vehicles as applications, basically, and are encouraging both public and private sector partners to kind of think of ways to leverage our information for various applications. We've got several different views that cities can access via our dashboard. This is our 3D view. This is, for those of you familiar with South Bay, this is an intersection in San Jose, Tasman Drive and Zanker Road. This is actually where our first pilot is. Here in the US, we just installed 4 radar sensors here and 2 pedestrian sensors, so gathering live information on this intersection and then providing the city with some analytics and intersection efficiency metrics. In this case, we're actually going to be doing a comparative analysis of what the intersection, how the intersection is performing now and how it would be performing if our software was being used. We're also interested in expanding to additional intersections in this zone. This is in the North San Jose Transportation Innovation Zone, and developing a capacity to pilot autonomous vehicles here as well, in alignment with the city's priorities there too. So I'm going to transition here quickly and just talk a little bit about our perspective on the current AV landscape. As we know, the automotive industry is very much so in transition right now. There's been an extensive investment in auto tech, both in traditional OEMs and in small startups bringing to market new technologies. There seems to be a somewhat controversial assumption that at some point these vehicles will not rely on infrastructure, that they will be able to negotiate priority on their own using vehicle-to-vehicle communication. I think the jury is still out on that one, and then more importantly, what happens in the interim? Depending on who you talk to, this kind of fully autonomous future is probably quite a ways out, 5 years, or for some folks, 20 years. And so what happens now? How do we help these vehicles integrate with existing traffic environments, really understand the movements of all vehicles in a zone, and assist and provide some benefits for all roadway users as technology develops, not just those cars that are connected or autonomous. We certainly see the safe and efficient deployment of AVs as not a one company or one technology solution. A lot of what we've been working on these last few months are pathways for collaboration, both with cities like San Jose, as I was just speaking about, and then partnerships within the private sector as well. So the capacity, particularly on the infrastructure side, for multiple companies to get together and combine their technologies to really provide an end-to-end solution that's going to deliver better analytics to connected and autonomous vehicles, and that can simultaneously provide public sector benefits as well. Just building on this to talk a little bit about the importance of intelligent infrastructure and why we can't just kind of forget that traffic signals need to be smart as well. As mentioned, it's a way to address the gap. So take us from what's happening now and providing a layer of intelligence and helping to transition to this critical mass of autonomous vehicles. One of the benefits of intelligent infrastructure is it has the capacity to generate efficiencies and higher levels of safety for all roadway users. It's not specific to vehicles that are connected or autonomous, and it really can be used as a platform that creates an enormous amount of public benefit through reductions in congestion and pollution, opportunities to maximize safety as well. I think another key point is developing more intelligent infrastructure is an opportunity to really include cities in the discussion about innovation and about connected and autonomous vehicle technologies. And as it was brought up earlier today, private sector companies often go around cities, most often because of procurement issues, and it just, particularly as a startup company, it's very difficult to think of any kind of product launch or business model around a procurement process. So kind of collaborating with cities to find workarounds to these issues and including cities in this discussion is really important. I think one of the one of the worries, if we aren't able to develop collaborative partnerships, is we're going to end up with very smart vehicles and very unintelligent signal infrastructure that's left over from the 80s at best at times, so 1980s. To talk a little bit about potential roles of cities, agencies, and legislature in this transition, I think cities really can help ensure that connected and autonomous vehicle deployment increases public safety and public benefit, and that there's a proactive role for cities and other agencies to take there, not just responding to industry demands or industry requests for pilot projects, but really dictating what those pilots look like and making sure that cities are getting what they need from that equation as well. I think the public sector can really inject some core values into the deployment and development of new autonomous vehicle and connected vehicle technology. I think we're all pretty familiar with the DOT Smart City Challenge, and those, what cities were putting forth were strategies that were really focused on increasing equity and connectivity, being able to reduce pollution, and enhancing the life for all residents. And without this injection of values from the public sector, these types of benefits may not inherently be incorporated by the private sector. It really puts the public sector in a role to be co-developers of technology instead of just policy influencers, and I think that's important. And again, things to keep in mind, cities and agencies really identifying how technology can help them meet their public sector mandates, and again, pushing back on the private sector to make sure that it's not just a reactionary response to companies wanting to come in and pilot, but that cities have really thought through how technology can assist them. And then finally, living labs and test zones. This technology is going to be more robust if if there have been many miles piloted in living labs, and regardless of what can be done in simulation and in kind of off-the-grid test zones, I think cities still make the best living labs for not just for piloting these technologies, but for helping companies really iterate products in a meaningful way. So some few policy thoughts that have come to mind for me in the last 6 months to a year, just through various discussions I think number one, focusing on the important issues. In my mind, that's safety, and keeping policy objectives broad, understanding that this technology is not going to look the same 5 years from now as it does now. Our CEO likes to talk about the smartphone analogy, and if we all think back to what phones looked like 20 years ago, mobile phones, you had this like case that sat in your car, and it's a very different ballgame now. And so when we're thinking about creating policy around connected and autonomous vehicle technology, realizing that technology is going to change much more quickly than policy will change. So trying to keep those objectives very broad. I think paving the way for demonstration and product iteration, again, to occur in a live environment is really important. And again, there needs to be a safety mandate there. But if cities and municipalities are able to really pave the way for pilots and test deployments, it also guarantees them a seat at the table. Again, that this technology is developed with their input. This has been touched on earlier today, rethinking public-private partnerships. I think there are a lot of opportunities for the private sector to help out with infrastructure investments, to provide some CapEx for new infrastructure, particularly right now. There's so much movement in this space. It's really a matter of figuring out, new pathways for public and private organizations to work together. Procurement, which was touched on today as well. New policies to encourage owner-operators to experiment with new technology and give them a means for addressing risk. Cities and agencies are risk-averse, and technology and innovation is kind of by design risky. And so if there are ways that we can address risk that doesn't dump all of the risk on private sector companies and can create some opportunities to test new things, I think that's great. And And then finally, our hope is that California continues to be a leader and encourage innovation in the connected and autonomous vehicle space. I think at a state level, there's a lot of opportunity to guide legislation for AV pilots and also encourage individual cities and municipalities around the state to develop their own connected and autonomous vehicle pilots, providing policy guidance there so we avoid this patchwork of policies regarding connected and autonomous vehicles and deployments. That certainly will make things easier on the private sector side if there's kind of one set of regulatory guidance around what needs to be fulfilled. So that's all I've got for today. Thanks so much.
Hey, thanks. You guys really enjoyed it. It's a good panel. I have to make one really quick statement while I'm thinking about it. It's non-technology. This building, it was kind of cool. I've worked here for years in Sacramento, never been in this building, but the state Supreme Court used to meet here, I guess. So it's kind of a cool room, I think. But enough about the room. So do we have any questions? I've got a couple, I know, but.
Thanks. This question's for Jennifer. You mentioned equity, and that's one of the challenges that we run into in our programs with Edison, and it kind of falls into two buckets of how we satisfy that. It's either guaranteeing a minimum amount of allocation to specific groups or increasing funding for certain types of programs to specific groups. And I'm wondering what DOT is doing to address that technology equity and what you may be doing or wish you could do in the future to enhance that.
Well, I think one of the opportunities is with transit. And so I encourage the DMV to take up regulations over 10,000 pounds because I think that there is tremendous opportunity in transit, first and last mile. Subsidies are something that is there, but I think that as the public sector, we want to create carrots and sticks that allow for this to transcend different communities and be it not just urban and rural, but also rich and poor and the able-bodied and those that aren't. So it's really making sure that there are incentives throughout all aspects of transportation for this. But yes, I think that public transit and modes that are subsidized by the public sector need to be very deliberate in that.
Okay, great. Janet?
Can I just build on that, on your response there? I just have a question. Some would argue that, we are subsidizing transit now, but we're not getting the performance. And so I can think about and worry about, how do you provide a funding in a way that actually gets an outcome? And are you confident that just a subsidy, do you have some basis to I'm not trying to challenge you, I'm trying to probe. Is there some basis for an understanding that incentives or subsidizing is the way to get the outcomes that we're looking for? I don't want to just put money out there and not get a response from it.
I think that's part of why data is so important.
Okay.
I think that, yes, public transit, the ROI on public transit, it's not a moneymaker in any city in the world.
Which is fine if you get butts in a seat.
Right? And there are other benefits that come with it.
Right.
And so I think we have to recognize those, but I think that data can help us make sound investments, supporting first and last mile, providing multiple modes of transportation and making sure that those are accessible to people of various means. I agree with you. I don't think you just throw money at a problem. I think that you need to make intelligent decisions based upon where people are going, how they're getting there, when they're going there, having the ability to control different levers with pricing and with opportunity.
Thanks.
Hey, Jennifer. Since you mentioned data again, and this is the right audience, I think that's so critical. A few years ago, we had someone from the London Metropolitan Organization come and talk to us, and the Transport for London every year conducts a 10,000 person survey that's half travel household survey and half kind of customer satisfaction survey. We have nothing like that in any of our metropolitan regions. Our statewide Our census travel data is woefully inadequate for the future. It's all just projecting past behavior. It asks, how did you get to work last week? And now we know that people go a different way multiple days of the week, but if you drove 2 of those 5 days or 3 of those 5 days, you're a driver. And so I think that can't be brought home enough. I mean, it's sad because if we were to start today, we'd be behind because we could only start, collecting data right now. The question I wanted to ask you was about, the infrastructure. City of LA, I think, has like 4,000 intersections, right? And so the infrastructure demand of trying to do something is huge, and so when you look across all of Southern California, some of the cities don't even have those kind of resources. So when we talk about this wonderful future of cars talking to signals and all of this happening, there's going to be a huge delay between the cities like Santa Monica and Los Angeles and Pasadena that might have the resources and other cities that don't. So how, I don't know if there's a question in there, but just, what can you as a city tell the state, in terms of how are we going to address this funding locally?
Well, just to be clear, we don't have the resources. I don't think that any city, regardless of how big or small, is prepared to replace 4,500 intersections worth of infrastructure. So I think that is a huge issue to confront, and also in terms of what is the needs of those infrastructure. What language is the connected infrastructure communicating in, and is that universal to all of the OEMs? I don't know. So in terms of how to fund it, I don't know yet. And what does it need to look like? I don't know, but I think that we need to start peeling back the onion on that and looking closely at it.
Yeah. Did you have? Oh.
Thanks. I'll pass the mic elsewhere. So I have a question for Catherine on, reducing the environmental impacts from freight transport is, we have a dire need to do that. And so I'm curious if you have examples of some of this intelligent infrastructure being used to support, less emissions coming from trucking and other, freight transportation activities.
Definitely. We don't have any active pilots in this space. Right now I've got a few projects in the pipeline that we're working to develop currently, but I can kind of walk through how it works basically. So, we see our solution as acting as kind of an interim between what's happening at the port and these vehicles reaching the highway, and then that it's then in the realm of autonomous trucking and automated trucking. But basically what we can provide is signal prioritization for those vehicles along arterial routes, and we can do that picking up the vehicles via radar, or we can get a GPS feed. And so along designated routes, maybe even at designated times, these vehicles will be given an advanced priority and be able to move between the port and the freeway, often through an urban core or suburban core more quickly, which reduces congestion. I think one of the biggest concerns is these trucks idling and accelerating, so reducing congestion if they're just able to breeze through this corridor, and pollution as well, noise, all of the kind of negative aspects of commercial vehicle travel. So got actually 2 pilots that I'm working to develop right now, where we would be showcasing our capacity to do that prioritization. So, next.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. Jeannie, I work for the California Bicycle Coalition, and one of my questions about this sort of transition world that you guys are talking about is, there's going to be a period of time, obviously, we're not going to jump straight into this like fully autonomous world, and I think there's potential for backsliding in terms of encouraging more people to walk and bike because of a fear of this kind of Wild West where there's like some autonomous vehicles that are very law-abiding, and then some people who are like annoyed that there's all these law-abiding vehicles and they're speeding around the roads. And so I think, perception of safety is really important, especially for bicyclists. And so I'm wondering how much and maybe this question is more for Jennifer, but how much you're thinking about sort of infrastructure provision for bicyclists in particular in this transitional space. It seems to me like there's a real need to really build out sort of physically separated space for people bicycling to ensure that there's not, this fear of being on the road with autonomous vehicles and in the
Absolutely.
transition.
I don't think that the city sees any type of new mode as supplanting bicycling or pedestrians. I think that healthy communities have people on foot and have people on bike, and that we need to continue to support that. We've had a doozy of a couple of weeks in Los Angeles having this debate about, what mode do you prioritize and how do you give equal access and equal footing. But I think that one of the things that is going to be an interesting debate to be had in the technology world is with regards to safety, and how do we ensure that autonomous vehicles, the question is, how do they prioritize the passengers inside or the people outside? And that's a really difficult ethical decision that I'm pleased I'm not in a position to make. But in terms of an automaker, I believe there was an automaker that came out and said that they would prioritize the passengers inside. And that obviously is an uncomfortable sensation if you're a pedestrian or a cyclist.
So I really appreciate the comments about the importance of public policy. And I guess one of the points to the broader issue about transit, I think, there's a reality about places where we can provide very high quality public transit if transit is well funded, and places where we're unable to provide the quality of service we'd like. So that is, I think, one basis for also saying that the landscape in terms of opportunities to use other services should be managed differently by the public sector. I think we're doing a really poor job currently in the places, in downtown San Francisco, for example. I don't think we're enforcing traffic laws, and the ride-sourcing companies are using an enormous amount of free curb space, et cetera, et cetera. So, there's near-term actions, I think, that policymakers need to look at. But I think also the points that Susan made about, different cities or different environments, and part of it really does have to do with the ability, I think, to provide high quality transit or bike and walk access. So, these things all kind of need to be context sensitive. There are some places where the new opportunities are going to be, fabulous improvements, and other places where we have to protect the quality of the service because we can make it, really good if we make the right choices.
I think there's no one size that fits all, which is another reason why data is important, so that we build the infrastructure that suits that location. If we know that people are taking TNCs from point A to point B, then let's build curb space there and build loading zones. It may not make sense to build fixed transit in that location. Rural and urban are different. They have different needs. So let's create a toolbox, and let's create the means to achieve the needs and to meet the needs of the people in the different locations. But we can only do that if we have the right information.
Hi, my name is Pablo. I guess my question is kind of geared towards the relationship between private corporations and cities of Los Angeles, of that sort that are going to be hopefully the ones leading the way in adopting such technology. And the question really is just focused on the data part. So with private industries such as a smartphone, I have options of, I guess, who can track my data and know where I am. And when when you put something like infrastructure so strong like that, if I don't want to be tracked and know that I'm going down this street, then my only option is to go down another street. And I guess I'm a millennial. I'm okay with being tracked. I'm probably tracked right now, and I'm okay with that. But for some individuals, that kind of sense is a very insecure feeling. And I guess as a city, how do you handle that balance between allowing private smart infrastructure and your citizens' concern? And as a private industry, how do you go about working in making that first step relationship?
I can certainly address the private sector side of that. For us, it's a bit of a non-issue in that our data is anonymous by design. So we don't know who you are. We actually say that if we need your personal information to manage traffic, then we're not managing traffic. We've got an ulterior motive there, and so we don't collect any personal information. What we're interested in is basically the classification of mode. So if you're a pedestrian, a bicycle, or a bus, and then really understanding the overall dynamics of the system that you're in order to create efficiency. So, and I think it's certainly relevant, though, in that depending on how a lot of these technologies develop in the private sector, you know, there may be a push toward the use of private data, and you know, there are certainly ways that can be protected, but and end user agreements, of course, you know, having people buy in to have their data used. But I think, you know, that's, you get into a slippery slope, and I think a lot of that will depend on you know, how what communication methodology is used for communicating information from infrastructure to vehicles and vehicle to vehicles, and you know, who the players are in that game and what their intentions are. So
I would just add to that we don't actually want your personal information. We want to know about movement, and we want counts, and we want to know origins and destinations, but I don't actually need to know who's doing it. And using data for transportation planning has been basically an ongoing process since the advent of transportation. In 1984, the city of Los Angeles innovated something called the ATSAC system, which was used to manage traffic flow for the Olympics, the second Olympics that the city held. And that's very, very basic. It's an analog system that has almost no information. And currently when we use cameras, we don't keep that information. It's really just about the counts. And so one of the things that is a struggle for the entire industry is how do you aggregate the data in such a way that eliminates personal information? And are there, you know, are universities the right place to house that? Is it a cloud-based system? Is it an escrow? What is the right place for that? And I think we're all ears, and we're game for it. We just want the information.
Okay, any other questions before we conclude? Okay, I just wanted to again thanks both to Catherine and Jennifer for coming. Thank you very much, you guys. Really appreciate it. And before we do hit the road, I don't know if Susan Branson, our Executive Director at the Transportation Commission, if she had any final remarks to make, and then we're done for the day. Thanks, you guys. Really appreciate it.
All right, I know that we're all ready to go, but I wanted to just in closing, just thank you all for coming today and for watching on the webcast. And I wanted to do a special call out. In preparing for this today, there were several commissioners that were instrumental in helping us set the agenda. They had to just leave, but just shortly before we closed. But Commissioner Gardino and Commissioner Kehoe and Commissioner Medaffer, Commissioner Inman, and you know, there are a few others, but I just have to tell you the commissioners were so interested in bringing forward speakers that we don't typically hear from, and I just really want to thank them. I really want to thank Eric Thronson. This was his idea, and just can't thank him enough. Garth Hopkins, Doug Remedios, we have Laura, we have Curtis, Mitch in the back, and just all of our, and there's Curtis, all of our commission staff. Also the State Library for hosting us. And I think just one thing before we leave. There's just so many comments and I was jotting them down, but there was one that actually Michael said earlier, and it stayed with me, that we have to imagine the future today to get the policies in place for a great future. And I think, it was something that his remark, he said, and it's like, we all need to work together. We all have different purposes with our careers, and it takes all of us to come together to talk about what are those policies that we need to put in place. So I hope this is a start of us all working together. I know that we all do, some of us already, but there's just, just these panelists out here that we heard from today. I think just a wealth of information that when we all work together and put our minds together, we can probably do something great in the very near future. So again, just want to thank you all for being here today and look forward to seeing you at our next one. Thank you.